So I hope you got refreshed, caffeinated, and re-energized with a little bit of honey and desserts, and are ready for the next session. This was an amazing panel that we just had. With the panel that we're going to speak to now, first of all, I'd like to express the regrets of Dr. Kathy Abo, who was supposed to be moderating this panel. Unfortunately, she is unwell, and so she had to step back. So I am taking her place. I'm going to do the best I can to really do the work that she had prepared so well. So on this panel, we have 4 panelists who are working on the ground. So we really did set the scene and really raised a lot about the issues around how we can talk about mental health, what does it mean, in a fairly abstract kind of way. And now with the panelists that we have here, we're going to really dig out and look at what are the triggers and what are the different treatments for the various populations which each of you are dealing with, because you all are dealing with slightly different populations. And I think this is going to be the very richness of this panel. We have, and in no order, maybe in order of how you're sitting, Taban Shoresh, who is the founder of the Lotus Flower and also of a new organization called TPB, Therapists Beyond Borders, in which she will talk about. But Taban's intervention is basically on the work that she's been doing within a refugee community in northern Iraq, and she is dealing with girl and women refugees that are have been actually survivors of conflict and violence. We go further on to Rasa. Rasa is a partnership and development director of an organization called StrongMinds, which I was very happy to discover from a panel discussion, which I was half listening to, preparing for another panel discussion I was going on, and Kathleen was shouting at me, "What are you doing? Turn off the panel, what you're doing, you're supposed to be speaking." But I was fascinated by the work of StrongMinds, who are, again, they're specifically working with depression amongst women and girls, both in rural and urban settings, in underserved communities in Uganda and Zimbabwe or Zambia? Zambia. And it'll be very interesting because some of the work that they're doing is really related to the work that Inka spoke about in the last panel. Raj Mariwala, who is coming to us from India, she is a director of Family Foundation, and they are working specifically both on the policy and advocacy side, as well as funding programs in the field, and really specifically looking at mental health amongst marginalized communities, and again bringing up the issue of the relationship, I think, between stigmatization and mental health. So I think that's a whole different perspective, and I think a very interesting one we're going to be touching on. And all these things were really touched on in the last program, so it's nice that we have a kind of continuation. And Pieter Ventevogel, who is with the I'm sure I mispronounced your name, Pieter, I'm sorry. No, right? Who is the head of the mental health department of UNHCR, and so has actually a kind of bird's eye view, I think, of situations where you have migrant populations who have undergone all sorts of different kinds of traumas and are living, which is in itself traumatic, in camps, and how you are dealing with those situations. So just a little bit of background. The purpose of this panel is to really understand the triggers, find the commonalities, discuss the barriers to treatment, the types of treatment, and a real opportunity for knowledge sharing. And I think one of the things that I found really touching in the last panel was that there was clearly going to be something going on after. This was not a moment in time, but the panelists were going to start working together. So this was really part of the work that we're doing here. So I will start, I don't know what order I did this in, but anyway, here it says Raj. So I'll start with Raj. I would like you to introduce yourself and why the mental health of girls and women is such an important issue for you. And I would love personal stories because then we can relate to them in a real way. So Raj, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, it's absolutely lovely to be here. And as Atalanti said, I'm the director of a mental health organization that does work in India. And currently we run about 35 projects with 30 partners in 21 states, in 20 languages in India. And some of the communities that we work with are farmers, victims of violence, people who live in hilly regions that are kind of far off, rural communities, migrants, LGBTQI communities, and people who live in regions of India that may face internal displacement or conflict from the state or the government. And that's the organization. I think in terms of why I do this work, or the personal story as you put it, I think it's an issue very close to me for multiple reasons. One is because I'm a person with lived experience, that is, I live with a mental health condition, but also a learning disability, and I'm on the autism spectrum. And I think it's not that you don't face discrimination. It's not that you know that systems aren't made for you. It's just that I had recourse and ways to deal with this that were in my control and that I was amenable to, but many people don't. So that's one reason. And the second reason is I honestly, coming from feminist activist background, I do believe that mental health is a feminist issue.
Thank you very much. I would like to go to you now, my dear friend Taban.
Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you so much to Giving Women and the sponsors and for holding such an important conference. And I really hope that other organisations lead the way in putting mental health first. So I'm Taban Shoresh. I'm the founder and CEO of Lotus Flower. And I've also set up an organisation called Therapy Beyond Borders. And I think what I'll share with you is, I guess, more personal stories to kind of put into context how someone can go through mental health crisis conditions, but also flourish and have impact on the community on a large scale with absolutely nothing. So I'm a genocide survivor myself from Saddam Hussein's era. So I was a child political prisoner. I escaped being buried alive. I saw things in my childhood that I should not be witnessing and seeing as a child. We arrived in the UK as refugees, and that had its own challenges, and growing up as the diaspora in a new region has its own challenges in itself, not just for myself, but for my mother and my family, parents who had just been forced out of their countries to relocate and adjust to a new region. I personally was married at a very young age, and so again that has its own mental health crisis that comes with it. I was in a very abusive marriage for 6.5 years. That also has lots of things that came with that. But as well as that, I've got a chronic illness, and I've had to readjust to being disabled overnight, but an invisible disability. So you look at me and I look completely healthy, but actually there's things that you can't see. So throughout my life, I've had various different stages where mental health has popped up and been such a big crisis for me. And I've secretly learned how to cope with it. And I've been forced to secretly learn how to cope with it because of the stigma that it carries and how I guess, especially in certain cultures, and in my culture, it's not something you talk about. If you talk about mental health, it means you're crazy. You are put into some sort of asylum. We don't talk about that. We just move on. We carry on with our problems, and you find a way to move on. You know, especially in my mum's generation, where the concept of healing doesn't even exist. It's more something where they've just readjusted to living. I guess the positive to that, for me, has been the inner resilience that it's kind of pushed and developed inside. But it also made me realize, what do I do from stopping another woman and girl to experience this? I really do not want them to go through what I've gone through. And in 2014, I went back, I left my job in the city in London and went back to northern Iraq when ISIS had gone into the region. And this is where ISIS had caused the humanitarian crisis in the region, and I worked very closely with the women that were enslaved, raped, and used as sex slaves by ISIS. And having seen the impact that that had left on the displaced community, especially the women and girls, it made me realize there was a connection to my past, and what do I do to kind of stop that from happening or alleviate the pressures and support it in some way. And when I left Kurdistan, I decided to set up the Lotus Flower in my living room with absolutely no money, no connections, nothing. But I knew exactly why and what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a bridge between those two worlds to make women and girls realize that they had some way of rebuilding their lives. And the premise of the Lotus Flower is that we have centers, which are safe social spaces, where they can heal, learn, and grow. And it's really that simple. Is the community projects that we implement in these centers are completely focused on involving them in what they need, so asking them from a community level what they need, but also finding solutions and providing platforms and opportunities for that healing process. I think that's my 5 minutes up, so I'll carry on later, but yeah.
Rasa, please speak about your work with StrongMinds.
You have me going after her. Okay. I work for StrongMinds. StrongMinds treats women with depression in Uganda and Zambia. The reason I do what I do is because of the great need. You've heard some of these statistics today already. In Africa, the WHO estimates that 85% of those who suffer from mental illness have absolutely no access to treatment. And you've also heard that women suffer from depression at twice the rate as men. So what we see in Africa is a vast, vast need that is not being met of women who are suffering from depression. My personal story, I guess, on how I got into this, I was in graduate school doing conservation biology. I was studying human-wildlife interactions, and I was living in Samburu, which is in northern Kenya. They're sort of like the northern cousins of the Maasai, and it's a polygamous culture where they practice female circumcision. And so I spent 4 months there and went to multiple weddings with girls that were the age of 13, where they were circumcised on their wedding day. And I did a really good report on human-elephant conflict, but I left a solid advocate for women in Africa. So I've been at StrongMinds for 4 years. I think it is such an important thing to be doing, because I think everybody can resonate with the idea that if your mom is depressed, the whole family suffers. And so for me, the other aspect of the work that we do is that we're not just healing the woman, we're not just working with the woman on reducing her depression symptoms, but we're also helping the family. And what we see is that when a woman is no longer depressed, her whole family thrives. Her kids go to school more often, her family eats more meals a day, and her household economic productivity increases.
Can I talk or should I wait? That's not easy after 3 strong women. I'm Pieter. I'm a psychiatrist by training and an anthropologist, a bit like Roberto in the first panel. I'm with UNHCR since about 9 years now, the refugee agency, and I came in, as it goes, as a consultant to help them write a report, because they thought we should do something with mental health. So I wrote a strategy, and then I thought maybe we should implement the strategy. Can you stay? and I stayed, and in the end I created a position, and here I am still. It is significant because when I started, there was no one in UNHCR who was really focusing on mental health. It sounds incredible, but it was like that a decade ago. I'm still alone in the head office, which is not so nice, but also okay-ish, because we need to have people in the field, and we have. I had a call with my colleagues yesterday, and I'm so happy to see all the faces, Ugandan psychologists who are in Sudan, Ethiopians who are in Kenya. So we see a really, really good workforce. Now, why I do this work, because that's what you also wanted to know, is two things. One is a discomfort that I felt in the Netherlands when I was trained as a psychiatrist to sit within the four rooms of a wall, between the four walls of a room, to heal people. And I worked with asylum seekers and refugees, and it was so difficult. It didn't work because the social context that they were in was not touched by what I did. And then I learned global humanitarian mental health, which is much more community-based. It's out there. It's not in the clinic only. That's what I want to promote. Now, a second thing is anger, if I may say so. Anger at the injustice that people suffer. Some suffering is unavoidable, we know that. But some suffering really is avoidable, and we should do more. And that means, we talk about that, what that means. And there is a personal touch as well. I'm speaking as a professional here, but I'm also a human being. I had depressions, 3. Depends how you count, psychotherapy, medication, mindfulness. I'm out of it, but I know somehow, as I think many of us, how it is to be in a bad mental health state and how important it is if you get help.
Thank you, all of you, for being so honest in your stories, because I think you're so right, Pieter. We've all, in some way or another, have felt those feelings, stronger or less strong, but we all are part of it. Just wanted one quick question to you, which is on the list. So your teams that you have all over the world and are all locally based. They're local people.
Okay, as much as possible, yes. Not always, because sometimes the specialized knowledge that we need is not available locally. Mm-hmm. So, but the goal really is to build strong local teams. And I need to make one step aside, and that is UNHCR usually doesn't directly implement. So we don't have teams of psychologists who treat. Mm-hmm. We work with partners who do that we fund, NGOs, or with community groups, and we train the community groups. So we work slightly more in an indirect way. But yes, localization is one of the big things, and it's clear why. I mean, we have now in Sudan a mental health professional who is from Syria. He's a Syrian refugee by origin, great guy, worked in Iraq with an NGO. He can do so much more in Sudan, speaking the language, being a Muslim, being a refugee. I mean, it's clear.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Taban, when you were setting up the Lotus Flower, was the psychosocial part of your program integral right from the start, or is that something that evolved based on the work you were doing?
100%. I think the first way that we approached the Lotus Flower was, even though I've experienced a lot of the things, I didn't go in assuming that I knew exactly what they wanted. So we went to the women and asked them what they wanted to see. And these are women, a lot of them at the time that we were working with, the initial group was Yazidi women that were impacted by ISIS. And they said, we've kind of had enough talking about our stories. We know what's happened, but we've also had our partners killed, and now I can't feed my child. So that's becoming a problem on top of all the other problems that I have. So can you please help me find a way to get back on my feet, and then I can start healing? So we realized that they were asking for other holistic forms of support. So what we realized was, it's not just one element, it really has to be holistic. And providing that safe social space was the first biggest step, because the men and boys could move out of the camps, they could leave the camps. They had cafes and tea houses where they could gather and mourn together and talk together. The women could not really leave their tent and cabins without permission or an excuse to leave. So we gave them an excuse to leave their tents and cabins every single day by having that safe social space. And the way that we implement our projects is it's aligned to SDG goals. So we have education and livelihoods, health and safety, which includes mental health, and peace building and human rights. And we work holistically across all our programs to make sure that we implement projects. Now, for example, we've got economic empowerment projects, we've got therapists in all our centers. Also, culturally, it's a community-based therapy. So when you bring the women and girls together in a shared experience, they are naturally healing by sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, and you realize over time that healing is happening naturally. We've also got one-to-one support. And then, for example, we work on gender-based violence, and the women will say to us, you need to speak to our men and boys, not just us. So that's when we started integrating the men and boys into the program, and we did it slowly by, believe it or not, in the Middle East, implementing a project called Positive Masculinity. And it was very, very successful because we went in very slowly to see how it was and what they wanted. And eventually the men came to us and said, we need mental health support. So that kind of triggered us to start our men's trauma project. So actually, if you look at it, it's the full cycle, it's the whole holistic approach, and including the whole community. From that, we've gone, okay, actually, what about the youth over there that's ignored? And suicide rates amongst the youth is really increasing. So we started a youth suicide prevention project. So actually, it's integral to include it in all the projects that we do. Boxing sisters, for example. Who would think that I could take boxing to Iraq? To girls and women, we took it. And part of the reason was we needed to find a way to, A, break the stigma, but also allow them to channel their anger and their emotions through a physical platform. And that was boxing. And we've got, I'll share at the end some success stories from that. But it really is a holistic approach, but also making sure that it's included from the start.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because clearly what you're looking at is dealing with what are the triggers to and helping the healing by addressing the triggers, rather than sitting in a room with the four walls and asking, what are you feeling? It's a really different approach, and very, I'm sure, very effective. Raj, you said you're working with marginalized communities. What are the triggers and stressors which are causing the mental health issues in your communities?
So, well, I think that's a massive question, and one that I cannot answer, but instead let me, I think, talk a little bit about the approach and why it's important to look at this in a particular way. And before I start, I may not look up at you all the time, and again, that's in disability work, we call that reasonable accommodation, and it's just something that I need from everyone to do my work as anyone else would. This is me alluding to systems not being made for people with mental illness. So anyway, moving on to the approach. In South Asia, where I am, there are some factors, some structural factors that kind of influence and play a role in determining what sort of daily stressors you may face, what sort of exposure you may have, and your vulnerability to mental illness. And these are the factors: ability, caste, class, ethnicity or race, gender, sexuality, and religion. And these not only influence how vulnerable you are and how much you can face, but of course they influence how much recourse or how much action you're able to take to address them, right? So I think before moving on to any kind of examples, I'm going to say, unfortunately, these factors affect policy. Are policies made for people who may be marginalized by caste, by ethnicity, by gender or by sexuality? No, not at all. And unfortunately, this creates a vicious cycle of inequality in health. Now, I'll give you one example. In 2021, post-COVID, 230 million Indians were pushed further into poverty. Now, that's led to a lot of food insecurity. So in technical terms, if you want to go there, it's a risk factor for both mental and physical health. But there is also anxiety, shame, powerlessness, and guilt. Now, this food deprivation is further linked to non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, anxiety, and it's accompanied with an increase in your healthcare costs. So essentially, if you're poor and you're facing food insecurity, not only do you have mental health concerns, but you're actually pushed further into poverty. Now, if I use structural factors, women who face homelessness and food insecurity are even more vulnerable to sexual assault and gender-based violence. And that leads to a higher chance of depression, anxiety, stigma, shame. But we can't stop there because there is nothing such as a standard category of women and girls. There are fault lines around caste, like I said, gender, ability. So trans women, women from indigenous or tribal communities, sex workers, women with disabilities are never ever counted in these definitions, and neither are their stressors addressed, and nor do they have recourse for these, right? So I think to look at stressors, one must really look at how we are understanding inequalities in mental health, and based on that, yes, I may be suffering from depression or anxiety, but what if I'm a woman living in a rural part of India and access to any sort of support is maybe 2 hours away in a district hospital, maybe in a language that I don't speak, and maybe I have to take a day off and I'm a daily wage earner. So I think there are many issues around what a stressor for a marginalized community could be. But it's not just the stressors, it's also what we can do about them. And these are intimately linked to the sorts of marginalizations one may live with. And I don't know how much time do I have left?
Go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I'll go back to one other example, the idea of girls and women. Now, this is a very unidimensional example, and these fault lines exist everywhere: women with disabilities, women who are brown, women who are black, women who live in rural settings, trans women, trans men, lesbians, bisexual women. Where do all of these people fit in when we talk about mental health and access to healthcare? Because the other problem is that our very health systems themselves have inbuilt these structural factors that only reflect the mainstream, which means that they're reflecting, in essence, stigma and discrimination based on all these factors. So the daily stressors don't just come from daily lives, they also come from exclusion at policy levels, at livelihood levels, education, and, of course, healthcare systems themselves.
Yeah, no, that I think that you explained it very well, because in addition to poverty, and it's the exclusion within, there is no place for the marginalized within the system. So that is a further stressor within the already triggers that we've talked about already. Okay, thank you so much. Rasa, you work in a different environment with girls and women suffering from depression. Can you describe the triggers and how you support their communities? Because the community is so central to the work of StrongMinds and so powerful. Thank you.
So StrongMinds, we use a type of therapy called IPTG. It's called interpersonal group therapy. And it is a group talk therapy model. The type of therapy is based on a randomized controlled trial, which is just a very strict sort of testing of the therapy that happened in Uganda in 2002, I believe. So we started in Uganda because we knew this type of therapy would work in that country. The way this therapy works is it doesn't dive into what happened in your past. It really focuses on what's happening with you right now. And so there are 4 triggers, 4 sort of universal triggers that our facilitators work with the individuals who are in the therapy group on. One of them is conflict, so this can be interpersonal conflict, it can be conflict with family, spouses, friends. The other is life changes, so that's things like losing your home, losing your job, moving, sort of very big deal upsets in your life. Another is grief, the loss of a loved one, and then the 4th one is isolation. And so when we begin our therapy, what we do is we sit down with each individual and we identify what is their trigger. Sometimes there is more than one trigger, but just the act of knowing what your trigger is sort of that first step towards figuring out what your coping strategies can be. And so the way our therapy works is it's groups of 12 to 14 women in communities. We also are very, very strongly rooted in the communities. So every single one of our facilitators in Uganda is Ugandan, and in Zambia is Zambian. Our model has changed a bit over time. So we started off training staff. We had mental health facilitators that were paid by StrongMinds staff, and they would go out into the communities and they would run these groups. And something that's really resonated that I've heard so far in this conference is the connection of individuals with other individuals. And for us, we find that that's really the secret sauce to our work and to why we're so effective. So our therapy is 90 minutes a week over 8 weeks, and at the end, we have over 80% of the women who are in our groups depression-free. That is minimal depression symptoms, which is massive. I'm going to get really technical for 1 second, which is we measure them on a PHQ-9 scale, which is from 0 to 27. Western audiences consider a 4-point reduction clinically significant. We, on average, see a 12-point reduction. So we're seeing a huge, huge reduction in depression symptoms, which means a huge increase in individuals' lives and their families. But the secret sauce is these women together. Our facilitators are trained, but the effects last past those 8 weeks. 80% are depression-free. We've come back 6 months later. 80% or more are still depression-free. We've come back 2 years later, and 80% or more are depression-free. And part of it is because so many of the women that we're working with have been so isolated. They've not left their homes, they're not communicating with friends, they're not communicating with families, they are alone. And so the first thing you'll hear in these groups when these women get together is they'll say, I had no idea I was not the only person who felt this way. And then these women go through a journey over 8 weeks, and our facilitator is just doing that, facilitating. They're holding the space for these women to share what are things that are happening in their lives, what are difficulties, and then these other women are providing suggestions and coping strategies, because when you are depressed, it is sometimes really hard to see what might be very simple for somebody else to see as a fix to your issue. And so these women form these very lasting bonds. I was in Zambia at the end of last year, and I visited a group, and they went through therapy in 2019, and they continue to meet every single week since 2019 until now, and they are seen as leaders in their community. They are seen as sort of the people that other community members go to for advice and for support, because they've gotten this sort of level of information about depression and triggers and symptoms. So I can stop there.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And again, I think a thread that we've seen throughout so far in the conference is also that importance of community, the importance of really breaking that silence of being alone and not really understanding what you're suffering. And I think something that was very interesting, and I think you probably told me, that there is no word for depression in some of the local languages. There is no such word, so it's like you have to describe it through the symptoms, which is again very, very telling. Pieter, we've talked about the access to psychosocial support, and I think in the environment of the UNHCR, in the refugee camps, with people in migration, access must be also extremely difficult, both in terms of help creating these environments where you can give psychosocial support, but also identification and actually people being able to speak about what they're going through. So can you dig a little bit deeper for us and give us some insights about how you work?
Yeah, the first thing we need to look at, of course, is that the prevalence of mental health conditions is very high globally. And within the people who have a mental health condition, most of them are not able to find adequate support and care. But within displaced populations, like refugees, the problems are even larger. So it's very hard to do good research, if you can imagine. Doing research in a refugee camp is not easy. But on average, we can say that the number of mental health issues is about double to that of a non-displaced population. So the problems are really urgent, and they are very much linked to the agency of people, the ability of people to fend for themselves. If you are affected by mental health issues, you're less able to navigate very difficult circumstances. So what may seem a luxury problem becomes a matter of life and death in some cases. So that's what I first want to say. Now, how are you going to address these issues? I can give some, the estimates that we use are the estimates that you can find in the World Mental Health Report that INCA presented. In displaced populations affected by collective violence, roughly 1 in 5, 22%, has a clinically significant mental health condition. That's a lot. Really, that's a lot. And 1 in 20, 5%, has a severe form. So really the needs are enormous, and then your question is then what are we going to do? How are we going to address this? And it's really a whole range of things. There is not one quick solution, that should be clear. But what I would like to highlight is what I call the 3 Ps. Well, that sounds a bit funny actually. But the first P is proximity. What we see, great inequities in service delivery in low income, everywhere, but certainly in the countries where we work, low and middle income countries. And refugees tend to be in the remote, poor corners of countries where you just don't have much services. So we need to bring services to the areas where refugees and host communities, because they're often as badly off, live. So proximity, but that's not enough. It's not just a matter of building more hospitals everywhere. It's also a matter of providing logical points of access. That's my second P. And that's not always a psychiatrist or a psychologist, because people may just not feel comfortable of going there, not even think of it. I very much liked this discussion point that you mentioned about words for depression. And in many of the cultures that I've worked, people have words. It's not that people don't have words, but they're different. They don't align 100% with medical classification. So people may say, my head is tired, or my heart is heavy. And those are indications that it's not going well with someone, and maybe someone needs support. So, and it's much easier if you have a heavy heart, or you're thinking too much, or whatever, to go to somewhere where you feel safe. So this could be a community center, a women's group, a sport club for youth. Sport is a great entry point for mental health for young people, by the way.
All the things Taban is doing.
Well, I love what Taban is doing, because I like the word that she said, safe space. A safe social space, it's so key. So that's my second P. And the third one would be people. I think that's also mentioned. It's not just about professional skills, it's also about who you are, how you interact. So that's still skills, but more than knowledge. So these 3 things we need to invest in: proximity, logical points of care, and also people that are able to help. And then I can talk for hours, but if I can give one example from my own country, the Netherlands. We had a major plane crash 15 years ago. A plane crashed in the area, and then some of my colleagues from the academic hospital, they did psychological interventions with the survivors. And they were good. They did research, randomized controlled trial, and they found out it didn't help. Really didn't help. But they also looked, by talking to people, what did help you? And guess what? The Salvation Army, who also went there very quickly, just with plain language, no pretension, with some soup, some coffee, and just saying, hey buddy, how's it going? That helped people, which again is a logical point of access with people who are close to you. Anyway, I can talk for hours.
Yeah, and it's very much talking to the issue of each and every one of us being open to reach out to people that are going through difficult times, and that how powerful and how strong that can be.
Yeah.
And our fear sometimes prevents us. So I think this is a really important conversation for all of us. Raj, you said something when I was reading, I don't know what you said something that again resonated with me. You talked about not taking a Eurocentric approach. Could you elucidate, and I totally understand, but can you talk about it a little bit?
Sure.
And I think we've heard a lot about it already. It's been touched on. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think everyone who went before me just kind of touched on the fact of no word for depression in XYZ language, right? So I think one is, I have to say that I always say this Eurocentrism approach thing because it is the default in the approach. And when I say default, I mean it's powerful and unnamed, which means that it is the kind of reference point or the starting point for mental health interventions, research. Now, if I just take depression and anxiety, as people have said before me, there may not be the words, but it also means that if I'm doing work on depression and anxiety in, say, India, I would need to find people who may have access to a diagnosis, not sure whether that's going to happen, may have access to a language, not sure whether that's going to happen, and as Taban said, access to a safe space to even share your stressors. Again, all unsure that that's going to happen. And the problem with this being like this kind of unspoken default, inbuilt in that is that it is biomedical and it is individual, when in a lot of the contexts that we work in, we know that community and cultural markers are very key to shaping experiences and mental health. So I'll give an example. India has 17% of the world's women. And now when I say women, I'm talking about cis women. Cis women are women whose genders are aligned with the gender that they were assigned at birth. That's another part of, by the way, what a Eurocentric paradigm means, is that there's invisibilization of a whole range of genders, and the only gender that we see is binary. That's part of the Eurocentric paradigm. But anyway, I'm digressing. I have figures only for this binary gender paradigm because that's the way our mental health systems function. So India makes up 17% of the world's female population, and we account for 40% of the world's female death by suicides. Now that's a massive disproportion. 75% of these women die before the age of 30. That's due to a range of factors related to control around gender and sexuality. Forced marriage, arranged marriage, lack of agency in choosing a partner, lack of agency in maybe mobility or being able to access and find a job. So there are many cultural issues and community issues, and working on those is very important, and naming that Eurocentrism and understanding it is very important if we are to kind of change the paradigm and work slightly differently. Because if we don't name it, it's going to keep on operating in the same insidious, invisible manner.
So basically what you're saying is the cultural environment in India is very different to the cultural environment in Europe?
Kind of, but not really. I mean, another example, I think the panel before me spoke about, I think Pamela was talking about prisons and prisons being mental health providers. Where is that coming from? That's a Eurocentric legacy. Way back when, before asylums, there were two types of asylums. The asylum for paupers and the asylum for the criminally insane. And that's one of the legacies in mental health, just as we have in India. What caused asylums to spring up in places like India? It was colonialism. And that's one of the legacies. That's one of the Eurocentric legacies that we have. Who gave police control over mental illness and crimes related to mental illness? It was actually the British in India that put in the law in the first place. So if we are to work on these mental health systems and the inequalities in them, it's very important to situate the default Eurocentrism in them.
Okay, so basically the systems that have been put in place through colonialism are integrated into the system in such a way that that has to be dismantled to be able to really understand the reality and to be able to put in place better systems.
In essence, yes. Also because, I mean, there is no treatment that we can give for gender-based violence or casteist violence or racist violence, right? Which does not mean that we still do not have mental illness. Of course, mental illness and neurodivergence is always going to be around, and that must never be erased. But that biomedical portion of it is not the end-all and be-all. It is not the starting default. And that's what we need to kind of remember.
I think one of the real sort of fil conducteur that's been going through is that medicalizing is not the way forward. This is not the way, and in some ways I think that we've, it almost created stigmas more than really giving medicines and not really dealing with the triggers. At UNHCR, you're looking at a variety of approaches. So, Pieter, could you perhaps go deeper into that and give us some examples? Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. I will give very brief reaction on some of the things that I've heard, if I can, because because I think it's so important that we have attention for the underlying structural drivers of unwell-being. So, and for refugees, that is of course very clear. The best things we can do for refugees is to come to durable solutions. That means either they can go back in safety to their own country, or they can be legally fully integrated in the country where they are. Like it happened with Burundians a decade ago. They became Tanzanians and fully with all the rights. Or they get resettled to a third country where they're integrated. And all these three options are actually, the doors are closing. Mm-hmm. So you are left with populations that are increasingly stressed and are sometimes losing hope, and it's really serious. Now, so we need to advocate. But I'm also a clinician, I'm also a doctor and a mental health professional. So I cannot wait till the structural social violence that refugees undergo has been solved. We need to do things now. And then we face the issue of really limitations in resources. So we have to be smart. We really have to be smart. And then our buzzword in global mental health and humanitarian mental health is task sharing. I defended my PhD 8 years ago, and I almost failed because one professor was not very amused by what I said, because he said, Pieter, isn't the solution we need just to have many more psychiatrists in Afghanistan and Burundi, whatever? And I said, well, actually, no. Yes, we need more, but psychiatrists are a little bit, and I hesitate, or I should say it again, because maybe I'll be chased, a little bit like cow dung. They are, if you spread them thinly over the land, they're a blessing. But if you put them all together in one place, it stinks. Now, what I mean with that is you need people like Julian, like me. We're good guys, I tell you. But we need not to take only the position of the expert and we will do everything. It's also about how to help people to learn from us and with us. Now, when we talk about task shifting, so it means we need to shift tasks or share tasks with others. And I want here to defend now, a bit to retake myself, to defend also the medical. To defend the medical. Because we need to realize that many doctors and nurses and midwives are insufficiently trained in mental health. And that is bad, because people with mental health conditions very often go to doctors and health centers. And if the doctor doesn't know what a depression is and has no clue how to talk with someone who is, let's say, disturbed, they're doing bad things. So it is important to train medical staff. And UNHCR uses the methodology that we developed with WHO, called MHGAP. Basically, they are crash courses in mental health for doctors and nurses. And I'm very strongly a believer in that. Because I think it's just a no-brainer. Every health worker needs to know sufficiently about mental health. I also listened to what Roberto Benaduce said. He said, in practice, it may amount to giving pills. And he's right, it happens sometimes. So we need but that's not just because of me or Julian. We try our best to help doctors to become better doctors and to not only seek a solution in the pill. So I think it's important to do that task sharing in the medical model. But, as I said, we also need to go out of the medical model. So the second layer would be psychological support. Now, Rasa will say more about that. There are many psychological interventions that you can actually do by trained non-professionals. Yeah. IPT is one of them. So, and then I go to the last one. I'll stop about this. But the last point is about the social things. I think we need to do much more in terms of social work interventions. And the entry point there is not psychopathology. The entry point is whether you're marginalized, whether you are discriminated against. So there are approaches also in task sharing to do that. So it's medical, psychological, and social work.
Great, thank you. That was really fantastically articulated. Rasa, do you want to go a little bit more deeply into the way that you prepare the workers that go into the communities and work with girls and women with depression?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I also feel, I agree that, so much of our interventions have a Eurocentric approach, which ties directly to task sharing, which makes it super weird for me, a white American, to be talking about this. But our country director was on the online forum the other day.
Yes, she was fabulous.
She's really the expert.
If you didn't have a chance to hear that panel that we had you will receive the recordings, and I really, really encourage you. It was a fantastic panel,
Yes. So the way we implement therapy, I think I mentioned that our model has really shifted over the past 9 years. We started out doing 16 weeks, we're down to 8 weeks. We find that we're still as effective. We continue to tinker and tweak the model to make it as effective, cost-efficient, and scalable as possible. We started off with only trained mental health facilitators that were on staff. We then started a peer facilitator program, so these were graduates of our therapy. We found that at the end of each of these therapy groups, we would have at least 1 or 2 people that would come up to us and say so consistently, "This has changed my life. I don't want anyone else to feel this way in my community. Will you train me?" And so we adapted our training model and started training peer facilitators who are graduates of our program. We find that they are almost as effective as our trained paid staff. And we really looked at this as a way of keeping our model sustainable. So what we were starting to see was that in communities where we had a really good cohort of peer facilitators, we were no longer needed. There weren't enough depressed people for us to treat. So we could get up and leave and know that our peer facilitators were there to cover future depression episodes with individuals who needed therapy. The pandemic hit, and Uganda and Zambia shut down completely. And for the first time since the organization's beginning, we were faced with having to turn our groups off. We had to turn them off. We were no longer able to treat individuals with depression for the first time, at a time when the world was in the most mental distress it had ever been. And so we really quickly pivoted to figure out, how do we do this? How do we continue to reach these individuals and communities that we can't get to? And so we worked with a group of global experts and transitioned our in-person therapy model into a teletherapy model. And our treatment is free in communities, and so we needed to make it free for teletherapy as well. So we pay for the airtime, and as long as you have access to a dumb phone, not even a smartphone, you're able to call in and get teletherapy. We then started to see that there were certain communities that we were unable to reach with the phone. One of them is refugee communities. We're working in refugee settlements in northern Uganda, and the cell reception there is absolutely terrible. And we knew that the need was still there, and so we started a different type of model where we started to train individuals over the phone on how to deliver therapy, and then provided guidance and oversight and support to these facilitators, so that they could actually conduct therapy in the communities that they were already living in. And so we called this the hybrid model at the time, because it wasn't individuals with lived experience. It was just individuals who wanted to be trained to help their communities. From there, we saw that it was just as effective as our peer facilitator program. And so we started to look at integrating in government systems. And so we're now working with the Ministry of Health in Uganda and piloting in Zambia, and we're working with the Ministry of Education in Uganda as well. So the Ministry of Health, we're working with village health teams. These are individuals that are embedded in their community. They work with the Ministry of Health, and they work on a variety of issues, malaria, HIV. We're now training them on how to run group therapy sessions. We have over 1,000 volunteers in Uganda that are doing this through the Ministry of Health. And what's really interesting is, before, if you had asked us what was the hardest part of our job, it was to find the women, the individuals who are depressed. What we're seeing now is with these village health teams, that is becoming so much easier, because these individuals are in the community. They already know, once they're trained on what are some of the symptoms, they already have an idea of who might actually be experiencing depression, and they're already trusted. They're members of the community, they're known. It's not like they have to go in and introduce themselves. We also are seeing higher attendance rates with these individuals. People are showing up more and more consistently than they would if we were sending in our staff people. And then we're also embedded in the Ministry of Education. So in 2019, we adapted our model to address adolescents. Adolescents have very different needs than adult women, and so our model uses a lot more visual cues and a lot more prompts. We have an emoji deck of cards where you can point to say how you're feeling instead of having to sort of verbalize it. And we found that it was wildly successful with adolescents. We had a very small group of schools that was willing to host us in their schools, and they gave us an hour of their precious school time once a week to treat these adolescents. We found that the kids' attendance increased, their grades are increasing, their participation increases, they're getting a better with their families at home, and they have a much tighter circle of friends at school as well. So last year we piloted training teachers in these schools to actually run these groups, and at first we were not sure at all if it was going to work. And what we're finding is that it's absolutely working, and not only is it working for the individual adolescents that are being treated in schools, but it's working for the teachers. The teachers are becoming better teachers. They actually understand, they've been psychoeducated on depression, they understand what some symptoms are. They're more empathic to individuals who are going through things in their classes. They're more approachable, they're more willing to problem solve with their students. And I've actually spoken with teachers who have said, I'm a better teacher because of this training, and administrators have said, these students are going to these teachers so much more. So today we're treating in 97 schools in Uganda, and we hope to be treating in every school in Uganda in the future. And then we're doing something very similar in Zambia as well. However, our audacious vision is to offer free depression treatment to every single person in need in Africa, which is a lot. And our scaling model has been pulled together, but I actually want to just say something a little bit provocative, which I raised with Raj earlier, which was mentioned in the previous panel, which was the idea that poverty causes depression. Different circumstances cause depression. But I would actually, I'm not going to say it's not true, but I would challenge the assumption, because when we go into communities, when we're in the compounds of Lusaka or the slums of Kampala, and we do assessment for depression, we find that 20 to 25% of the women that we assess are depressed. If poverty was causing depression, why is not every single person assessing as depressed? So one of the ideas behind our scaling model is that our model makes your model better. So we're looking to work with governments and NGO partners, which is if we go in and we treat those 24% of isolated individuals who are not able to take advantage of all of the other opportunities that are being offered by other NGOs or government assistance in the area, if we treat them for depression first, they're better able to take advantage of those malaria nets, of the reproductive health guidance, advice, and support.
Great. No, that's wonderful. Yes.
I'm wondering whether I can quickly respond. And I think one on the medicalization, I know that there's a lot of anti-medicalization conversation going around, but honestly, I would not be sitting here if it were not for my medication.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make, because I think that it gets a bad rap. Is that the word? A bad rap? And I think you're right. There is a place for everything. There is a place for everything, and we need not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Absolutely. So that's very, very good.
And very quickly, I will say that I'm not sure about the origins of task shifting. I do believe in it, although apologies, I hate the term task shifting. I prefer stepped care, because again, if I go back, now you'll say that I'm a stuck record, but if I go back to the Eurocentrism, it privileges the expert in this, whereas if I look at stepped care, I'm saying it's very valid to build these resources into the community, because the communities know their social fabric, and it is far more accessible to go to a community worker than it is to go to a psychiatrist in a district hospital. And I'll give you one example. One of the biggest programs that we run, that is a stepped care model, operates in 590 villages in a district that is 90% rural, so there are 600 villages. In that district, we have 2,400 volunteers who are mental health champions across these villages, and these champions are able to provide about 2 counseling based on training sessions to people in need, but they have a further uplink to 800 other volunteers who live in this area who can provide the next 5 sessions of counseling, who then have another uplink to the psychiatric person sitting in the district hospital who can then dispense medication as well. But as I was saying, medication is not the end-all and be-all. There are inclusion and linkages to electricity connections, to disability benefits, to employment, to livelihood, to education, because we know that people with mental illness are systemically excluded from these. So that was the point.
Thank you so much. I have one question, and then we'll go to so we've talked a lot about the lack of access, and I think particularly in refugee communities. I have a small shelter that I support in Greece, which is set up for women refugees who have been survivors of gender-based violence. One of the issues, and I'm addressing this to Taban, is that access to that support is sometimes very difficult to find. Also, just the navigating, the language issue. So I think Taban has a plan to overcome this. So I'd like Taban to say a few words about this. And then we'll open to the... Oh, sorry.
Do a little dance as well at the same time. So I guess the best way to describe this is kind of describing all the problems that we faced in the context that we work in. So proximity was one. When we had the ISIS conflict in Iraq, this humanitarian crisis unfolded, and the trauma and the post-traumatic stress and the extreme forms of trauma that was faced by the women and girls was so overwhelming in the region. We didn't have enough specialists to actually treat the women and girls and men and boys. So that was the biggest first thing was, we didn't have any therapists. We'd have organizations saying, we've got funding, we can build this hospital, and I'd turn around and say, okay, are you going to fill it with therapists for the next, 3 years maybe? And obviously that's going to be a no. And so that was the first thing, was we didn't have access to enough therapists. Secondly, we didn't have actual physical access. So you might have had a few therapists that were in a different city, but they couldn't come into the region. And then I'd go to the UK, and then I'd have therapists saying, what can I do to help? I would love to help and support. How can I help you? And I'm there going, well, if you can fund yourself and go to the region for the next 3 years and support in our centres, please do. And obviously it would be a no. Now, my background's in technology, and I know that mental health is multifaceted, so it's not just going to be a solution that you provide or throw technology at it, but actually I also know that the vast innovation in technology has the potential to kind of find solutions for this. So I thought, and I also was seeing that there wasn't enough data in the region. So I'm there trying to find data, and I can't find enough mental health data globally. And then also you've got organizations all doing things separately, and we're all arguing over the same funds to do the same thing, essentially. And so I thought, hold on, how about if we build an app that will be, let's describe it as a hospital, and that hospital has different departments in. So you'd have refugees and displaced community, you can have human trafficking and modern day slavery survivors, domestic violence survivors. So you've got all these different departments, and then in these departments you've got different rooms, and these different rooms are held by different organizations. So you'll have StrongMinds, you'll have the Lotus Flower, you'll have UNHCR, each one will have a different room. And in those different rooms, we will all have some therapists already, so the Lotus Flower would put our own therapists onto the platform, but what that means is our current therapists will have more reach through the technology, and COVID showed us, because we hire from within the camps, we were one of the only organizations that continued to function, and our mental health services just increased dramatically because we had access to the community, and we knew that gender-based violence was increasing. We knew that mental health services were needed, so our therapists worked around the clock. So we clearly know that there's a need from the community, and that technology can provide this service. But not only that, but for example, you have Arabic-speaking therapists or Kurdish-speaking therapists who know the culture in the UK or in France or in Germany, anywhere. And they essentially can go and pro bono their time to an organization that can't afford that. So you've got one avenue of getting, or two avenues of getting therapists on board, but also you have corporate organizations or donors saying, we really want to help with mental health support, but actually we only help women and girls, or we only help in education. So what you would do is you would direct the funding towards the rooms that are allocated to the interest according to that donor, and what they would do is they're paying for the therapy services for the end client. So the end client never pays for it. Now the technology is already out there if you look at the technology on its own, but actually technologies that are currently out there are technology apps whereby the end user, so I would go on there and I have to self-diagnose. I mean, I don't know what's wrong with me, but it's telling me, are you depressed? Have you got anxiety? Have you got bipolar? And I'm there going, I don't know, I just need to speak to someone. And then it also asks you, can you please bring out your credit cards? And I'm thinking, hold on, I don't have enough money to pay for this. But these organizations that go into these rooms already have the connections with the beneficiaries. They are already connected. And actually, these would be people that are completely under the radar. So, for example, in the UK, we've got the NHS, and people might say, you've already got free services and access to therapy. Actually, a human trafficking survivor does not. They're completely under the radar, and they would not have access to something like the NHS, or refugees in camps, or refugees on the move. But who does have access to them? It's all these direct implementer organizations that have that reach already. So they come onto the platform, and essentially what you're doing is you're building a hospital in each region. You'll have one in Iraq, you'll have one in Switzerland, you'll have one in Germany. You'll slowly build all these hospitals across the world, and then you build a data pool which collects all that data, and then you realize, oh wow, okay, this is where the gap is, this is where the need is, and this is where funding needs to go. And actually, if we increase funding in this area, maybe this will happen. Then you start benchmarking. So for me, in terms of using my technology background and combining it with this world, I realized, wow, you can actually do so much, and collaboratively, together, we can make such a bigger impact and maybe reach that SDG goal in 7 years' time. But obviously that needs support.
Thank you very much. So, Eliana, do we have some questions?
We have a number of questions. I feel terrible because my job today was really about making sure that your voices were heard, and I haven't done that very well. But the conversation has been so lively and exciting, so I haven't managed to intervene. I'll draw one question from this, because we are actually at time again, as it happens. But I would like to ask you a question kind of following up on the funding question, actually, is really for anyone. How are funders' approaches or funding restrictions limiting your ability to deliver your programs? Maybe just as a closing, and to close off this panel, I think there's a lot of people who are interested in supporting this kind of work, and just an interest of how is the funding and the way that funding is delivered limiting it. I think you've answered part of that question. There was also a question about UNHCR, whether your mental health support is automatically included in your emergency appeal and humanitarian crises. And then also, if StrongMinds, have you ever thought of expanding approaches to other countries since it's been so successful? And I will leave you with that. That's, I think, a good handful for you guys to close off on. It's been absolutely amazing. So over to you guys.
So does any question? Does anybody want to answer any of those questions? Yes, Pieter.
No, I can definitely say about the humanitarian appeals, the refugee response plans, and increasingly, and that wasn't so a decade ago, we see that mental health and psychosocial well-being has a central place in it, and that's really important. Still, funding for dedicated mental health and psychosocial programs is difficult to get. We need it, we do get it, but I think we need really to go to a diversification of the response, which means, as Inka already said, integrating mental health and psychosocial support in all sectors. And then I have to say it, I agree with you about your task, what was it? Well, I like task sharing, I have no problem, but the idea is to come to a stepped care model, a multi-layered system that is not purely dependent on a few specialists with power, but that is actually empowering for everyone. Anyway, I've said it.
Yeah, that goes forward in that mental health is part of every intervention that we do, so that siloing is not going to get us where we want to go. Raj, do you want to say anything?
Well, I do agree funding is a constraint, and the way that funding happens is a constraint, but sitting from where I sit, I think the problem is that a lot of larger global funders maybe don't know how to prioritize where their funding goes, or the funding goes into much larger mental health organizations. And now this is very specific to India. What it's done to the Indian kind of mental health system is to ensure that there are 5 large non-profit organizations, and all the tiny ones are absolutely suffering, and all the great work that is happening is just not supported.
I think that's really, we need to get those organizations who are doing so much great work at the grassroots level and are not accessing funding. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a big issue. Rasa.
I am so glad whoever asked that funding question. Thank you very much. And just to respond to the funding question from the previous panel, I would say funding is the #1 most important thing, and the #1 thing that's restricting more mental health interventions around the world. To respond to the question about StrongMinds expanding beyond the 2 countries, yes, we absolutely want to expand beyond the 2 countries. As I had mentioned, with us training volunteers, what we're seeing is that our staff are now, instead of being direct implementers, right, instead of being somebody who's facilitating a group for 12 people, much like Raj was saying, our staff are now overseeing 20 people who are each facilitating 2 to 4 groups of 12 people. So there's sort of this exponential growth. And the way we see growing beyond these 2 countries is not for us to be a staff of 10,000 individuals, but really we want to embed ourselves with partners. We want to work with UNHCR. We want to work with Save the Children, with Oxfam, with all of the big guys to actually help them embed the type of therapy that we do with their programs and their implementations as well, because we think that the collaboration of the 2 makes both stronger. So that's really how we see our growth beyond those 2 countries, is not to set up country offices in every country, but to really work within the existing infrastructure so that it's done in a really smart, cost-efficient manner. And then in terms of the types of funding that are most important for us, mental health has a teeny, teeny, tiny funding space. I think it's 0.04% of funds that are given towards global health actually go to mental health. So it's a very, very small percentage that goes towards it. And as an organization, for us, what's most important is unrestricted funding. You heard me tell about this journey of how we went from staff to volunteers to teletherapy to hybrid to Ministry of Health to teachers. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have funders who were willing to trust us and willing to let us actually continue to tweak the model to get better and to move faster and to reach more people.
So, how much time, or am I over time?
Go talk really quickly. Yes, everything resonates here completely, and actually we need a StrongMinds sisters in our centre. What I would say is really, really simple, and as direct implementers, as 2 organisations, I would say that unrestricted multi-year funding is the only way that's going to make an organisation have long-lasting impact. And actually, if I started something in my living room with absolutely no money and no connections to now having impacted 44,000 women and girls, and half of that direct impact, then I can tell you I know how to spend the funds and make it go very far, knowing that our budgets are very, very small. So as organizations and local implementers, we know exactly where that money needs to go and how to make the biggest impact. In terms of, come and speak to me and fund TBB. We can change the world.
Yes, actually, I think that was a great question, because I think it's so true that funding is a barrier, and mental health is not getting the kind of money that it should be getting. And I think we also need to change the language. It needs to be included in all of the stuff that we're doing. So I think these kind of conversations are really, really helpful, useful. And thank you all for your wonderful interventions. It's been, again, my learning curve is going very, very fast. Thank you, thank you, thank you.